Hi, I'm Judi. I'm the data manager for NZLII. That's not my paid job. My paid job is in the Law Library at the University of Otago. Most of the work I do for NZLII is entirely volunteer. How many of you, though, had heard of NZLII before this conference? Yay, at least some people. How many of you have actually used it recently? Thank you so much. We've had over 19 million successful requests for information from NZLII for the first 10 months of this year. So it does get a lot of traffic, but so few people actually know of it. So NZLII is the New Zealand Legal Information Institute. It is part of a whole web of legal information institutes around the world. For those unfamiliar with NZLII, then I'm just going to give, I promise, a very short history. Hang on, I keep forgetting this. NZLII is a separate entity started in November 2004 after an Australian said something that peeved a New Zealander off. As for our current situation, NZLII is a bit like a 20-something who is residing in their parents' basement and refuses to leave. Our parent is AUSTLI, which is the Australasian Legal Information Institute. They can't kick us out of their house because they called themselves Australasian. They host the NZLII servers, they provide the software and all the technical expertise. In other words, they pay our rent, our power, our food, and do our laundry. Without that support and assistance, NZLII as it currently is simply would not exist. We don't get any government funding. Our primary source of funding for our projects is the New Zealand Law Foundation. They can only fund projects. They are not allowed by their deed to fund ongoing costs. As a free service, we really need more donations and benefactors. But neither the director, Donna Buckingham, or I are very good at blowing our own trumpet. In fact, we're both really introverted. We just don't have it in us to go up front and say to the law firms, give us money because you're using our service. By the end of this month, NZLII will have close to 300,000 documents on it, all available for free. Anyway, in 2015, we were contacted by PCO, that's the Parliamentary Council Office, about assisting with my dream plan of scanning and putting up as many of the New Zealand bills as I could. It's a companion database to our very popular historical acts. Why is it a dream plan? Because I'm nuts. I also have a history degree, so the history and the law going together. And I thought, given that we have so much use of our historical acts database, people surely would be interested in historical bills. PCO very generously offered not only to do the scanning, but to pay for the costs of us preparing the data and putting up the bills. We hired students to do the work, and we only charged back the actual costs of their salaries. We took nothing over the top. Pretty early on in the planning, we, and by we I mean primarily Michelle from PCO, discovered that the bills from 1858, 1860 and 1861 sessions of Parliament were not in their collection or in the Parliamentary Library one. Inquiries were made of any place that we hoped might have copies, including National Archives, the Alexander Turnbull, Auckland Public Library, New South Wales Parliamentary Library, the Library of Congress, British National Library. If I could find a person to contact, I would send them a begging email. Most of them just ignored me. I have to admit, I was incredulous that there simply were no copies left in the world at all. Most people who replied to me said that it's this one's fault. This is the White Swan. For those unfamiliar with the story, the White Swan is the name of the steamship that was commissioned by the New Zealand government to transport the members of Parliament, including Premier Fox and his wife and everybody else, and all the trappings of Parliament from Auckland to Wellington for a trial sitting of Parliament in Wellington in June 1862. On the 29th of June 1862, the White Swan, it was a foggy morning, the White Swan struck a rock. Reportedly, it was racing because it had made a bet about how quickly it could get to Wellington. No lives were lost, but the crates of official parliamentary papers were thrown overboard. The Daily Southern Cross, because I've been using papers past, on the 8th of July 1862 reported that Premier Fox offered £150, which is an awful lot in those days, to get the public documents out of the hold, but then that the crates were washed overboard. Other reports said the reward was for the safe return of the crates after they'd been thrown overboard. How many crates there actually were is another thing that the reports are not consistent over. So we don't even know how many crates there were, whether they were deliberately thrown overboard, whether they were washed overboard, and what was in it. The return to Parliament of the items lost includes the line, that one. Printed copies of certain bills from the Attorney General's Department. That's the only indication that parliamentary bills were amongst the material lost overboard. And to me, that line is ambiguous. The rest of the material being listed as lost overboard include account books, various letters, minute books. And so I don't think we can say that printed copies of certain bills actually means legislative bills. And even if it did, the way that the other material is described, if it had been the complete collection of sessional bills, then surely would have been described in a more accurate fashion. You can see about the way they've described the journals and the statutes, they've put the year, the number of volumes, not certain copies of bills. I also doubt that every copy of the bills would have been transported to Wellington for a trial sitting, given that the intention was the next sitting would be back in Auckland. And if they knew that all the copies were lost, surely a new set would have been reprinted. I don't know. The New Zealander from July 8th, 1862 does state that the most important records of the colony, letterbox of the Colonial Secretary's office, documents which money cannot replace, and the public accounts have been lost by the wreck of the steamer White Swan. My scepticism that all the copies of the bills from 1858, 1860 and 1861 could not have been lost appears to be supported by a newspaper report soon after the wreck. I always forget PowerPoints. I hate PowerPoints, sorry. Wellington Independent from 4th of July. Now, one has to acknowledge that the Wellington Independent wasn't exactly an independent voice in this matter because they had been heavily involved in advocating for the shift of Parliament from Auckland to Wellington. So, of course, they had a vested interest in downplaying the incident. But they did say that we're happy to say that owing to the quantity sent down by previous opportunities, the loss of public documents is not so great as was first reported. The bulk consists of a portion of the printed papers intended to be laid before both houses, of which the copies reserved for the blue books are at Auckland, i.e. not everything. Among the original documents lost, there are a letter book or two, some recent correspondence, audited accounts, and a few other papers of no great practical value. Nearly everything that is lost can be replaced, and the Assembly will not be put to much greater inconvenience than having to wait the Lord Wolseley's arrival from Auckland. Lord Wolseley was a ship, with duplicates of all the printed and substitutes for many of the other documents. Other reports, though, have said that in the years following, that every time they couldn't find something, they would just say it was lost in the wreck of the White Swan, even if it wasn't listed on this return. Now, I really wish that there was a happy ending to this mystery, that I could say, look, ta-da, I've found them. But if one looks at the bills that we have on NZLII for those years in question, 1858, 1860 and 1861, we've only got a small proportion of the number of bills that there should be, given the number of acts in that period. What we did get was the result of persistent searching by a retired former Parliamentary Library staff member, Rosemary Wilson, who spent hours and hours going through the various departmental files at National Archives to see if there were departmental copies of the bills amongst the files. I'm an optimist. I still have hope that one day someone's going to contact me and say they've found a full set of volumes, full set of them out there. I don't suppose any of you have got them in your collection, please? No? Oh, okay. Okay, in 1858, there were 81 acts, but we were only able to find 18 bills, 15 of which are unique, i.e. there are 3 of those amongst there that we've got more than one reading of a bill. Of those 15 bills, 6 of them don't have corresponding acts. So a rough ratio would suggest that we should have about 108 bills from 1858. Parliament didn't sit in 1859, so 1860 was the next year. 51 acts received the royal assent in 1860. A large number of bills in 1860 were reportedly denied assent. We have 24 bills, of which 18 of them are unique. 13 of those bills, so just over 50% of what we've got, did not pass, i.e. didn't get the royal assent and become acts. Those interested in New Zealand history will wonder about why there were so many not getting the assent in 1860. Taranaki land wars. A lot of the bills that they were putting forward were very much aimed at removal of land from Māori. And I have 2 of them here. So 2 of those bills not passed from 1860 are the Native Crown Grants Bill and the Native Districts Colonisation Bill. The copies that we were able to source from the national files at National Archives are, I think, they're gorgeous handwritten copies. I love the handwriting. There are typed copies of these 2 particular bills in the British parliamentary papers, because there was a lot of discussion about whether the assent ought to be granted for these 2. But I much preferred the handwriting. We didn't have much success in tracking down the 1861 bills. We only found 6 of them, compared to the 41 acts that received the royal assent. One assumes that the multiple copies of bills would have been originally printed, but they all appear to have gone. My worry is that this disaster will be repeated, probably not with our legislative material, but with many other government-produced materials. It was not so long ago that when a government department printed a report or a discussion paper, a couple of hundred copies of it would be reported, or would be printed and distributed to libraries and interested parties around the country. But with electronic-only documents, only 1 copy is present unless the National Library has it archived under legal deposit. When a website revision is undertaken, many older electronic reports and issue papers can be lost. An example of this is when the Securities Commission was revamped and became the Financial Markets Authority. Academics in my own institution and others around the country were distressed by the wholesale discarding of every single document that was on the Securities Commission website. They contacted the Financial Markets Authority and said, we use these documents, we need them, they are still relevant. And the Financial Markets Authority said, no, we don't care, we're a new body, we're starting fresh, we don't want any of that old stuff cluttering up our website. It was all gone. So an academic in the university contacted me and said, can we do something about it? So we created the Securities Commission database. When the government reports were being published only as electronic documents and was still a relatively new phenomenon, my then boss, Alan Edwards, who was the law librarian at Otago University at the time, would print out those documents, bind them, and add them to our collection. For many of you, I guess you think that's rather quaint these days, but in that it defeats the purpose of electronic publishing. But when all the material from the Securities Commission website was replaced, Those printed documents, in conjunction with the fabulous Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine, enabled us to recreate what we could of that discarded material. As an aside, in my law library hat, we get several interloan requests every year from other libraries and law firms for copies of those reports that Alan Edwards printed out. So not just Security Commission, but all government reports. He printed out every single one that came out electronic for several years. With the recent events, the fragility of our collections has become a lot more topical. I did write this back in May, I promise. Here in Wellington, both copies of printed legal deposit materials are kept within shouting distance of each other. Now, my husband's an IT manager. Backups are critical. No capable IT policy would allow one to store crucial backups in virtually the same location as the original. Having both legal deposit copies in the same place just doesn't make sense. I would like to submit that the logical facility we need to talk about moving is the Alexander Turnbull. An alternative may be to increase the number of copies that have to be deposited under legal deposit. In Australia, a copy also has to be deposited in the state library. Perhaps here in New Zealand we should look at a mandatory third deposit copy to go either in Dunedin or Auckland. I've only picked those because of their distance from Wellington. If there's 2 copies in Wellington, or I don't think Alexander Turnbull's going to move, but I'm just saying it, perhaps we should look at it. Then Auckland and Dunedin are at least the furthest away, so that perhaps we've got access to 1 copy if something happens. So what do I think would happen to those elusive bills, given that I really doubt that all copies were lost on the White Swan? Those among you who have library experience may have an inkling what may have happened. I believe that at least for the New Zealand copies, they were all weeded or discarded. The provincial legislatures would have surely have copies at the time. As an aside, we've got the provincial ordinances up on NZLII. Well, we've done them all, they're not all up. That's the downside to still living in the parents' basement. Any improvements are on their schedule, and so some of the provincial ordinance databases, like that of Hawke's Bay, Taranaki and Wellington, have been waiting, coming up on 2 years for NZLII to actually put them up for us. But the reason I brought them up was that we had a lot of difficulty in obtaining complete sets for scanning. The bulk we got from the fantastic Parliamentary Library Service, who had offered them up for disposal. But there were gaps, particularly from Southland. From memory, there are less than 5 complete holdings of the Southland provincial ordinances listed on WorldCat. Westland is even worse. So if we end up, for example, doing the various provincial gazettes, as many hope we do, hint, we really need funding to do things like this, then tracking them down may prove an issue. But back to the bills. Library collections face space stresses all the time. There may have been comments like, Parliament will have a copy, so why do we need to keep ours? Or, who needs copies of the bills? The important ones becomes X, and we have copies of them. It doesn't explain why the New South Wales State Library, the British Library and British National Archives say they don't have copies. The current policy, this is me getting political, sorry, this is my soapbox. Current policy of many institutions of, as long as there is 1 copy left in New Zealand, we can get rid of ours, is, in my opinion, dangerous, as is the partner policy that if it's available electronically, then we can throw our copy out, our print copy. 1 copy is not providing the current flavour word of the month, resilience. Wholesale discarding of documents has the real potential of another situation where every single copy in the country is lost. I should get down from my soapbox before I get into trouble from my paid employment bosses. Finally, I want to acknowledge PCO. At the beginning, I said that neither Donna or I are aggressive or assertive enough to go and directly ask for money. Neither do we want to build an empire with one of us as a dictator. The world would be a lot different if I was in charge. Instead, we've tried to encourage inclusivity and spreading the base. So if we can't get funding, then perhaps we can just get bodies on the ground. Canterbury University takes care of several databases for us. 4 district licensing committees loan their own material, as do various courts. We have several other databases of material from PCO. The Acts is enacted, 1841 to 2007. The regulations is made, 1936 to 2008, for example. It assists the PCO for NZLII to host those databases. That way, there was no way that users to PCO could get muddled with the no longer current legislation. But the material is there for researchers and anyone interested. And people do seem to be interested. For the first 10 months of 2016, we had 2.1 million successful requests made of the Historical Acts database. So that's over 10% of our traffic is going for that Historical Acts. 1.1 million requests have been made of the Historical Bills database, and that was only of the first group because we loaded up 1949 to 2008 back in March, so that's not even the full 10 months. NZLII, as part of the free access to law movement, guarantees anonymous access, so we don't track who they are, apart from very, very broad groups. But we do suspect that users of these 2 databases are probably not lawyers or those involved in litigation. Having the PCO material on NZLII has served the purpose of increasing the visibility of NZLII, which perhaps at some stage may result in some of those users donating to us to enable us to continue our services. I did say I was an optimist. The partnership between NZLII and PCO is one that's benefited everybody. PCO fulfills its public information role, NZLII gets cool material and more people using us, and researchers get access to the material. We're currently working with ACC on a very, very different project, and we're always open to collaboration with other entities or to people or institutions just like Canterbury University who wish to run their own databases. So if you've got some material that is legally, it's got to have some legal significance, then please come and talk to me. Kia ora, thank you.
So for question time, if you do have questions, can you wait until you have the mic, because we need to have them recorded for the stream. So do we have any questions from the floor? Just say, oh.
It's more a comment. Sorry, I'm from Australia, so I apologise for Osley. I'm just
we
wondering.
Love Graham actually.
I was just wondering about the high-level policy that's behind this. Out of interest, it didn't make sense to me that there isn't a policy that you could hook into, let alone funding, because that seems to be something that might be missing. Would you agree? Or?
Well, Australia, you've got a much better funding model with your research council, which is what Osley keeps tapping into. The Law Foundation it uses interest from trust funds. When you buy your house and have to put your deposit in, it goes into a lawyer's trust fund. The lawyers don't get the interest. That goes to things like the Law Foundation and also to run the community law centres. But apart from the money for the community law centres, it's strictly for projects and not for ongoing costs.
As the legal deposit librarian, some challenging stuff in there for me. We did used to have the 3rd copy, but in our infinite wisdom, it was at the Parliamentary Library, which is all of 200 metres away from the other copies, so probably not the solution. So that brings us to the end of this stream session. We're back in Oceania for the afternoon break. thank the good people at Auckland War Memorial Museum for sponsoring that. And then we're back in here at 3:30 for our final session for today's proceedings. So do go off and enjoy a last round of coffee and ice creams and so on, and we'll see you back in here.